I'm Clara Hayes, and at 29, I thought I'd finally carved out a life for myself, building my photography career, staying true to who I am, even if my sister married into one of the richest families in Seattle. But nothing prepared me for what happened the night I stepped into their estate for a simple family dinner. By dessert, my brother-in-law had humiliated me in front of 24 strangers. My sister looked like a stranger herself. And by the end of the night, their father exposed a secret so big, it shattered everything I thought I knew about my family and theirs. Before I share how one dinner turned into a life-altering confrontation, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you've ever been the outsider at the table, hit like and subscribe. This story might feel a little too familiar. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, my sister Brooke and I were, for the longest time, practically inseparable. She was just 2 years older, and we shared everything. Clothes, mostly hers, because she had better taste in high school. Secrets, dreams, even our anxieties. We were the Hayes sisters, a dynamic duo, known throughout our neighborhood for getting into all sorts of harmless mischief, and for always having each other's backs. Our personalities were a study in contrast, though. I was always the dreamer, the creative one. You'd find me constantly sketching in a notebook, or taking photos with the beat-up disposable camera our grandmother gave me for my 10th birthday. I was happy daydreaming through math class, seeing the world in textures and light. Brooke, on the other hand, was the practical one. Organized, focused, always aiming for perfection. Straight A's were her default, while I was probably doodling in the margins of my history textbook. Our childhood wasn't picture perfect. Nobody's is, but it was happy. Our mom worked as a dedicated nurse at the local hospital, always coming home smelling faintly of antiseptic and comfort. Our dad ran a small, but what seemed like a promising, investment firm. We weren't swimming in money, but we were comfortable. Family dinners were loud, filled with laughter, and often a chaotic debate about something trivial. Our summers were sacred, marked by weekend trips to the beautiful Pacific Northwest coast, building sandcastles and chasing waves. Life felt solid, secure. Then, everything just shattered. I was 15, Brooke was 17. I remember that evening vividly. The air in our living room was thick with a tension you could almost taste, even before they spoke. Mom and Dad sat us down, and their faces, they were drawn, weary. Dad's business had failed. Not just struggled, but failed catastrophically. He had lost everything, and I mean everything, including most of our family's savings. The details were vague, hazy, like trying to remember a bad dream. Something about a business partner, a deal gone terribly wrong. We didn't understand the specifics, not really, but the impact was immediate and devastating. Within months, our parents divorced. Mom, ever the pillar of strength, took on extra shifts, working herself to the bone to keep a roof over our heads. Dad, though. Dad moved to a small, quiet apartment across town. He became a shell of his former self, consumed by a bitterness and regret that weighed him down like a shroud. He wasn't the same dad who used to tell us silly jokes and build sandcastles. Brooke, being Brooke, responded to this chaos by becoming even more practical, even more driven. She secured a full scholarship to business school, a fierce determination burning in her eyes. She was set on never, ever experiencing financial insecurity again. For her, it was a promise to herself, a vow. Me, I retreated. I dove headfirst into my art. My camera became my shield, my way of capturing and making sense of our suddenly fractured world. "You need something stable, Clara," Brooke would tell me, her voice laced with concern, whenever I talked about applying to art school. "Look what happened to Dad. Dreams don't pay the bills." She meant well, I knew, but her words felt like a cold splash of water on my passion. Despite her concerns, I pursued my passion anyway. I worked multiple odd jobs, waiting tables, selling my sketches at local markets, anything to put myself through art school. It was a grind, but I loved it. I honed my photography skills, slowly but surely building a reputation in the vibrant Portland art scene. My focus was urban decay and renewal, finding beauty in forgotten corners, the quiet resilience of old buildings. Meanwhile, Brooke soared. She graduated with honors and landed a prestigious position at Sterling Capital Solutions in Seattle. That's where she met Ethan Sterling. He was the firm's golden boy, the charismatic heir, and the son of its founder, Arthur Sterling. Ethan was everything Brooke had envisioned for herself. Successful, stable, and from a family dripping with old money and connections. Their romance was a whirlwind, the kind you read about in novels. Just 8 months after meeting, they were engaged. I still remember the day Brooke called me, her voice bubbling with an almost frantic excitement. She described the proposal, the dazzling ring, and her future in-laws. "They're amazing, Clara," she'd gushed. "They have this incredible estate outside Seattle. Ethan's father built the company from nothing. This is everything I've worked for." I was happy for her, truly, but when I finally met Ethan at their engagement dinner, something felt off. He was handsome in that generic, privileged way. Perfect teeth, an expensive haircut, designer clothes that probably cost more than my rent. But his smile, it never quite reached his eyes. When he looked at me, it was with a kind of polite disdain. "Oh, you're an artist," he'd said, not even bothering to hide the condescension in his voice. "How interesting. Is that sustainable, actually?" I remember trying to keep my voice even, my jaw unclenched. "Actually, I just had my work featured in the Northwest Contemporary Gallery last month," I'd replied. He just nodded dismissively. "Well, good for you, I suppose. Someone needs to take the creative jobs." From that moment, a pattern was set. Every single time we met, Ethan would find subtle ways to diminish my work, my choices, my entire existence. My photography was a hobby. My apartment in the Pearl District was quaint. My lifestyle was unconventional. Always with that bland, unseeing smile that never reached his eyes. As the wedding approached, I saw Brooke changing. It was subtle at first, then more obvious. She started dressing differently, speaking with a more clipped, formal tone. Even her laugh sounded rehearsed. She'd cancel our weekly sister calls, citing frantic wedding planning or some vague work thing. When we did talk, she'd casually drop mentions of the Sterling family wealth or connections, almost as if trying to justify this increasingly obvious transformation she was undergoing. I was her maid of honor, standing beside her in a dress I probably couldn't afford, watching her marry into a family that clearly saw her as an acquisition, not a person. I heard Ethan's mother, Diana Sterling, pat my hand at the reception and say, "It's so nice that Brooke has stayed close with her background." The emphasis was clear. Her background, meaning not their background. After the wedding, the distance between us grew. Brooke and Ethan moved into a sprawling luxury condo in downtown Seattle. Our calls became monthly, then quarterly. When we spoke, Brooke would talk about charity galas and exclusive country club memberships, while carefully sidestepping any questions about whether she was truly happy. Meanwhile, against all of Ethan's predictions, my photography career flourished. I developed a distinctive style, focusing on urban decay and renewal, finding beauty in the forgotten spaces of our modern cities. My work started appearing in galleries across the Pacific Northwest. I started teaching photography workshops, sharing my passion, and was featured in several art publications. Not that Ethan ever acknowledged any of it. "Still doing your little photos?" he'd ask at family gatherings, before turning to talk business with someone he deemed more important. Despite everything, I missed my sister. The real Brooke, not this polished, almost brittle version, who seemed to exist primarily as Ethan Sterling's wife. So when she called to invite me to a dinner at the Sterling family estate, to celebrate Arthur Sterling's birthday, I agreed. Even though the thought of an entire evening with Ethan made my stomach churn. "Please come, Clara," Brooke had said, a raw note of desperation in her voice that she quickly covered. "It would mean a lot to me to have you there. How could I say no to that? Besides, after 5 years of marriage, it was about time Ethan's family acknowledged my existence beyond Brooke's artsy sister. Little did I know, this dinner wasn't just about acknowledging my existence. It was about to expose secrets that had shaped both our lives in ways we never imagined. The Sterling estate was exactly what you'd expect from a family with more money than taste. A sprawling mansion set on several acres of meticulously landscaped grounds just outside Seattle. As my rideshare rolled through the wrought iron gates, monogrammed with a ridiculously pretentious S, I mentally prepared myself for an evening of subtle condescension and feigned interest in my life. I dressed carefully, a black midi dress that was professional enough for the occasion, but still reflected my personal style with its asymmetrical hem and a vintage brooch. My copper hair was pulled back in a simple updo, and I'd kept my makeup minimal. I wanted to look like myself, not what the Sterlings thought I should be. The driver whistled low as we approached the main house. "Someone's doing all right for themselves," he remarked. "Old money," I replied. "Very old attitudes to match." He laughed. "Good luck in there." I needed it. The massive front door opened before I could even knock, revealing a uniformed housekeeper who greeted me with practiced politeness. "Miss Hayes, welcome. The family is gathering in the main salon." The interior was a monument to excess. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers that seemed to drip wealth, artwork that was clearly valuable but selected to impress rather than inspire. I followed the housekeeper through a series of rooms, each more opulent than the last, until we reached what they apparently called the salon. It was a formal living room, larger than my entire Pearl District apartment. Diana Sterling spotted me first. Ethan's mother was a slim, elegant woman in her 60s, her blonde hair expertly colored and styled. Her movements were deliberate and graceful. Everything about her screamed old money, from her perfectly matched pearl necklace to her subtly branded designer dress. "Clara, dear," she said, air kissing near my cheeks. "How vibrant you look tonight." Translation: "You don't fit in here." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Sterling," I replied, with a smile that matched hers in sincerity. "Diana, please," she corrected. "We're family, after all," in a manner of speaking. She introduced me to various Sterling relatives, who all blended together in a sea of expensive clothing and vague professional accomplishments. Ethan's older brother, Michael, and his wife, Charlotte, both corporate lawyers. His younger sister, Victoria, and her husband, David, who managed the family's investments. Cousins, aunts, uncles, all cut from the same privileged cloth, all regarding me with the same polite curiosity one might direct at an exotic, but potentially troublesome, animal in a zoo. I spotted Brooke across the room, engaged in conversation with an older couple. Even from a distance, I could tell she was performing. Her laugh was too loud, her gestures too animated. She was wearing a pale blue dress I'd never seen before, her hair styled in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Diana. When she caught my eye, relief flashed across her face before she excused herself from her conversation. "Clara, you made it." She embraced me warmly, but I felt the tension in her shoulders. "How was the drive?" "Fine," I said. "Your sister-in-law, Victoria, already asked if I took a rideshare because it's more environmental." Brooke winced. "They mean well." Before she could answer, Ethan materialized beside her, placing a possessive hand on her lower back. He'd barely aged since the wedding, still handsome in that bland, privileged way, still sporting that smile that never reached his eyes. "Clara," he acknowledged with a nod. "Glad you could make it. Dad's running late as usual. Business call. You know how it is." He paused, that familiar smirk tugging at his lips. "Well, maybe you don't." There it was. Not even 5 minutes in, and he was already taking shots. "Actually, I do," I replied smoothly, meeting his gaze. "I had to reschedule a client meeting to be here tonight. My exhibition schedule is quite full this season." Ethan's smile tightened. "Right, your photos. Brooke mentioned something about that hobby going well then." "It's my career, Ethan, as you know." Of course," he said dismissively. "Well, grab a drink. Dinner should be served once Dad arrives." As he led Brooke away, I noticed how she seemed to shrink beside him, molding herself to fit the space he allowed her. This wasn't the confident sister I'd grown up with. This was someone playing a role she'd been cast in without seeing the full script. I made my way to the bar and asked for a glass of white wine, needing something to occupy my hands and dull the edge of my irritation. As I sipped my drink, I observed the room falling into the habits of my photographer's eye, the careful groupings of people, the way wealth displayed itself not just in possessions but in posture, in the certainty that one belongs, the subtle hierarchies visible in who spoke and who listened. The Sterlings moved through their carefully curated world with the confidence of people who had never questioned their place in it. I wondered if Brooke truly felt part of this world, or if she was still the girl from Portland playing dress-up in designer clothes. Dinner was announced just as a commotion at the entrance signaled Arthur Sterling's arrival. Ethan's father was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and the kind of year-round tan that rich men seem to maintain effortlessly. He entered the room like he owned it, which of course he did, immediately becoming its gravitational center. Family members orbited toward him with congratulations and birthday wishes. As we moved toward the dining room, I found myself beside Brooke again. "You okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded, but her eyes darted around the room, nervous. "Just be nice tonight, okay? These dinners are important to Ethan." "When am I not nice?" I asked, genuinely hurt. "You know what I mean," she said. "Don't challenge them." Before I could respond, we were ushered into the dining room. It was an absurdly formal space, dominated by a massive table that could easily seat 20. Place cards directed everyone to their assigned seats. I noticed, with a mixture of amusement and annoyance, that I'd been placed near the far end of the table, about as far from Arthur Sterling as possible, without actually being in another room. As we took our seats, I caught Brooke's apologetic glance from her place near the head of the table. The message was clear: this is just how things are. Please don't make waves. I settled into my chair, preparing for a long evening of performative politeness and subtle exclusion. Little did I know that in just a few hours, the carefully constructed facade of the Sterling family would begin to crack, revealing secrets that would change everything I thought I knew about my own family's history. The formal dining room of the Sterling estate felt like a stage set for a performance of wealth and status. Crystal glassware caught the light from the elaborate chandelier overhead. Silverware gleamed against the crisp white tablecloth, and floral arrangements worthy of a small wedding adorned the center of the massive table. The housekeeper and 2 servers moved silently around us, filling water glasses and wine goblets with practiced efficiency. I was seated between Ethan's cousin Thomas, who had spent 15 minutes describing his recent golfing vacation in excruciating detail, and his Aunt Patricia, who had asked if people still buy photographs when everyone has cameras on their phones now. I'd answered their questions politely while watching Brooke from across the table, noting how she constantly glanced at Ethan before speaking, as if seeking permission. Conversation flowed around me but rarely included me. I caught snippets about stock portfolios, vacation homes in the Caribbean, and private school applications for Ethan's nieces and nephews. Occasionally, someone would remember my existence and lob a condescending question in my direction. "And what neighborhood do you live in, Clara?" Victoria asked during a lull in conversation. "Pearl District," I replied, naming my artsy Portland neighborhood. "Oh," she said, her expression suggesting I'd said something mildly scandalous. "Isn't that a bit urban?" "It's vibrant and full of other artists and musicians," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "I love it." "How adventurous," she murmured, before turning back to her husband. Diana Sterling maintained control of the dinner with the precision of an orchestra conductor, directing conversation topics and ensuring glasses remained filled. Everything was proceeding according to whatever script she had planned for the evening. Then, the dining room doors opened dramatically. Arthur Sterling strode in, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was taller than I'd expected, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that matched Ethan's. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never had to question his place in the world. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," he announced, not sounding particularly sorry. "The Singapore deal couldn't wait. You know how it is?" Everyone nodded, as if they did indeed know how international business deals worked. Arthur took his place at the head of the table, as Diana quickly instructed the servers to bring his meal. "Now," Arthur said, looking around the table, "I see some new faces since our last gathering." He looked directly at Ethan. "Ethan, why don't you make the introductions?" This was apparently a family tradition. Ethan stood to formally introduce each guest to his father, regardless of whether Arthur had met them before. It felt oddly performative, like a court presenting subjects to a king. Ethan rose to his feet, glass in hand. "Well, you know Michael and Charlotte, of course," he began, indicating his brother and sister-in-law, "and Victoria and David." He continued around the table, introducing extended family members and their spouses. I noticed how he emphasized professional accomplishments and connections. Uncle William, who just closed the Henderson acquisition. Cousin Mark and his wife, Samantha, who serves on the board with Mom. As Ethan worked his way around the table, I prepared myself for whatever dismissive introduction he'd give me. I was determined not to show any reaction, not to give him the satisfaction. Finally, he reached my section of the table. "And this is Brooke's sister, Clara," he said, his tone noticeably cooler. Then, with a smirk that sent a chill down my spine, he added, "Or as we sometimes call her, Brooke's quirky cousin who does some art thing." The room didn't exactly fall silent, but there was a distinct pause as several guests processed this deliberate insult disguised as humor. A few people chuckled uncomfortably. Thomas, beside me, shifted awkwardly in his seat. Patricia examined her wine glass with sudden, intense interest. I felt heat rise to my face as I maintained a neutral expression through sheer force of will. 5 years of Ethan's subtle digs hadn't prepared me for such a public dismissal. I glanced at Brooke, whose face had drained of color. Our eyes met briefly before she looked down at her plate, saying nothing. Her silence hurt more than Ethan's words. Arthur Sterling, to his credit, didn't laugh. He nodded in my direction with the generic politeness of someone acknowledging a server, clearly ready to move on to more important matters. Ethan, satisfied with his little power play, continued with the remaining introductions before taking his seat again. Conversation resumed around me, but I barely heard it through the ringing in my ears. I took a long sip of wine, considering my options. I could make a scene, call Ethan out on his rudeness. I could leave dramatically, making it clear how offensive his behavior had been. I could even accidentally spill my red wine on his undoubtedly expensive white shirt. But any of those reactions would only reinforce the caricature Ethan had created of me, the weird, emotional artist who didn't belong in their world. It would also embarrass Brooke further when she was already clearly mortified by her husband's behavior. So instead, I did the hardest thing possible. I stayed. I smiled. I made polite conversation with Thomas about his boring golf game. I complimented Patricia on her pearl necklace. I ate the exquisitely prepared but somewhat bland food placed before me. I performed the role of the unfazed guest who hadn't just been humiliated in front of 24 people. Throughout the meal, I noticed Arthur Sterling glancing at me occasionally with a puzzled expression, as if trying to place me. Each time our eyes met, he would quickly look away, returning his attention to whoever was speaking. I dismissed it as my imagination, or perhaps a lingering awkwardness from Ethan's introduction. As the main course plates were cleared, Diana directed the conversation toward Ethan's recent promotion. "Ethan has been made the youngest partner in the firm's history," she announced proudly. "Arthur, why don't you tell everyone the news about Ethan's new project?" As Arthur launched into a detailed account of some financial venture that Ethan would be heading, I caught Brooke watching me with concern. She mouthed, "I'm sorry," when she thought no one was looking. I gave her a small smile and slight shrug that I hoped conveyed "not your fault," even though part of me felt it was. She was allowing this treatment, had been allowing it for years. The dinner dragged on interminably. Dessert was served. An elaborate chocolate creation that under other circumstances I might have enjoyed. Coffee followed. Through it all, I maintained my composure, counting the minutes until I could call a rideshare and escape this suffocating display of wealth and superiority. I never expected that before the night was over, the perfectly curated world of the Sterling family would be turned upside down, and that my presence would be the catalyst. The dinner was finally winding down. Small conversations had formed around the table as servers cleared dessert plates and refreshed coffee cups. I was mentally calculating how soon I could politely excuse myself when Victoria, Ethan's sister, unexpectedly turned the conversation toward me. "Clara," she said, with what seemed like genuine interest, "Ethan mentioned you do some art thing, but I'd love to know more specifically what kind of art you create." I caught the slight emphasis she placed on Ethan's dismissive description, but chose to ignore it. Perhaps she was actually interested, or perhaps she was just filling an awkward silence. Either way, it was the first direct question about my work all evening. "I'm a photographer," I replied. "I specialize in urban landscapes and architectural photography, particularly focusing on the intersection of decay and renewal in post-industrial cities." "How fascinating," Victoria said, sounding surprisingly sincere. "Have you had your work displayed anywhere I might have seen it?" Before I could answer, Ethan cut in, "It's very niche, Victoria. Local galleries in Portland, that sort of thing." I took a deep breath, tired of his constant diminishment. "Actually, my work was featured in the Pacific Northwest Arts Review last month, and I currently have pieces in the Cascade Modern Gallery in Seattle and the National Cityscapes exhibit in New York City." Victoria's eyebrows raised slightly. "The National Exhibition, that's quite prestigious." Thank you, I said. It's been a breakthrough year for me professionally. What name do you show under? Asked David, Victoria's husband, who had been quiet for most of the dinner. Is it Hayes, or do you use a professional name? I exhibit under my full name, Clara Hayes, I replied. And that's when it happened. Arthur Sterling, who had been half listening to our conversation while discussing something with Diana, froze. His coffee cup was halfway to his lips. His head turned toward me so abruptly that several people noticed, conversations faltering around the table. Hayes, he repeated, his voice suddenly strained. Clara Hayes? The intensity of his gaze made me uncomfortable. Yes, that's right. From Portland, he pressed, setting down his cup with a shaky hand. I nodded, confused by his sudden interest. Yes, I grew up there. The dining room had grown quiet, everyone sensing the unexpected tension. Your father, Arthur said, his voice now barely above a whisper. What is your father's name? Ethan cut in, clearly annoyed by his father's interest in me. Dad, I hardly think Clara's family is relevant to... Daniel, I interrupted, my curiosity piqued. Daniel Hayes. Did you know him? Arthur Sterling's face drained of color so completely that for a moment I thought he might faint. He stared at me as if seeing a ghost, his mouth opening and closing without producing words. Diana touched her husband's arm. Arthur, are you all right? Arthur stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Excuse me, he muttered, before walking quickly out of the dining room. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone looked around in confusion, while Ethan glared at me as if I deliberately caused the disturbance. What was that about? Brooke asked, her eyes wide with concern. Ethan stood. I'll check on him. Probably just indigestion. But the worried look he shot his mother suggested he suspected something more serious. As Ethan left the room, the remaining guests broke into murmured conversations, theories about Arthur's strange behavior flying around the table. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. How did Arthur Sterling know my father? And why had the mere mention of his name caused such a dramatic reaction? Diana attempted to regain control of the evening, instructing the servers to bring out after-dinner drinks and suggesting everyone move to the drawing room. The guests followed her lead, but the carefully orchestrated dinner had clearly derailed. Brooke made her way to my side as people began to leave the dining room. What just happened? She whispered. Do you think Dad and Arthur knew each other? I have no idea, I replied honestly. Dad never mentioned anyone named Sterling. He never talked much about his business after it failed, Brooke pointed out. Maybe there's a connection we don't know about. Before we could speculate further, Ethan returned to the dining room, his face tight with anger. He walked straight to me, leaning down to speak in a harsh whisper. What did you say to my father? He demanded. Nothing, I replied, taken aback by his aggression. He asked about my father's name, and I told him. That's it. Well, he's very upset, and he's asking to speak with you. Ethan's tone made it clear he disapproved. Privately, in his study, Brooke placed a protective hand on my arm. Why does he want to talk to Clara alone? I have no idea, Ethan snapped. But this was supposed to be a celebration of Dad's birthday and my promotion, not some dramatic scene about your sister. I didn't create any scene, I said firmly. If your father wants to speak with me, I'm happy to do so. Ethan glared at me. Fine, follow me. As I stood to follow Ethan, Brooke squeezed my hand. I'm coming too, she said. Ethan turned back. Dad specifically said he wants to speak to Clara alone. Then I'll wait outside, Brooke replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan looked like he wanted to object further, but instead let out an exasperated sigh and led us out of the dining room. As we walked through the house, I noticed guests watching us curiously, wondering what connection I could possibly have to Arthur Sterling's sudden departure. We stopped outside a heavy wooden door at the end of a hallway, lined with seriously looking portraits of what I assumed were Sterling ancestors. He's waiting for you, Ethan said coldly. Try not to upset him further. As I reached for the door handle, I had no idea that I was about to learn a truth that would rewrite my understanding of my family's history and expose the rotten foundations upon which the Sterling family had built their wealth and status. Arthur Sterling's study was exactly what you'd expect from a man of his stature. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books lining built-in shelves, and an imposing desk that seemed designed to intimidate anyone sitting across from it. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old money. Arthur stood by the window, silhouetted against the night, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He turned as I entered, and I was struck by how much older he suddenly looked, as if the events in the dining room had aged him years in mere minutes. "Clara," he said, his voice steadier than I expected. "Please sit down." I took one of the leather chairs facing his desk, watching as he moved slowly to sit opposite me. Up close, I could see his hands trembling slightly as he set his drink down. "You look like him," Arthur said after a long moment of studying my face. "Daniel, something in the eyes." "You knew my father," I said. It wasn't a question. Arthur nodded, then took a long sip of his drink. "Yes, very well, once. He never mentioned knowing anyone named Sterling," I said, a bitter smile crossing my face. "No," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "I don't suppose he would have." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out an old photograph, sliding it across to me. I picked it up, surprised to see my father, much younger, perhaps in his late 20s, standing beside a similarly youthful Arthur Sterling. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling widely in front of what looked like an office building. "Hayes and Sterling Financial Partners," Arthur said, watching my reaction. "We started the company together in 1986. Your father and I were best friends in business school. We had big dreams, big plans." I stared at the photograph, struggling to reconcile this information with everything I knew, or thought I knew, about my father's career. "I don't understand," I said. "Dad ran Hayes Investment Group. He never mentioned having a partner." Arthur took back the photograph, looking at it with what seemed like genuine regret. "No, he wouldn't have. Not after what happened." The door opened suddenly, and Ethan strode in, ignoring his father's look of annoyance. "Dad, this has gone on long enough. Whatever ancient history you're dredging up can wait for another time. The guests are asking questions." "Sit down, Ethan," Arthur said firmly. "This concerns you too, whether you realize it or not." Ethan looked ready to argue but reluctantly took the chair beside me. Through the partially open door, I could see Brooke hovering anxiously in the hallway. Arthur took another drink, then set his glass down with finality. "Clara, what did your father tell you about why his business failed?" I thought back to those painful days of my childhood. Not much, just that there was a bad investment, a deal that went wrong. He lost everything, and then my parents divorced and our family fell apart. Arthur nodded slowly. "A deal that went wrong. That's one way to put it," he paused, seeming to gather his courage. "The truth is more complicated, and much less flattering to me." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, I really don't think—" "Quiet, Ethan," Arthur cut him off. "I've lived with this for too long." He turned his attention back to me. "Your father and I built our first firm together, equal partners. We were successful beyond our wildest expectations for the first few years. Then, in 1992, we had an opportunity to acquire a struggling manufacturing conglomerate." Arthur's eyes grew distant with memory. "Your father thought it was too risky. I disagreed." His voice was barely a whisper. We argued bitterly about it. I was convinced it would triple our firm's value within 5 years. Daniel insisted our clients' money would be safer in more stable investments. I listened intently, trying to imagine my father in his younger days, standing his ground against the formidable man before me. "We reached an impasse," Arthur continued. "And that's when I made a decision that has haunted me for decades." He took a deep breath. "I had our partnership agreement rewritten without Daniel's knowledge. I used legal language that essentially cut him out of major decision-making while maintaining the appearance of an equal partnership." My stomach tightened as I began to understand where this was going. With control of the firm's direction, I moved forward with the acquisition against your father's advice, Arthur confessed, his voice heavy. "I used most of our clients' investments to finance it, including all of the capital your father had personally invested in the firm." Ethan was now staring at his father, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "The acquisition was a disaster," Arthur admitted. "The conglomerate had hidden debts that didn't appear in our due diligence. Within 6 months, we were hemorrhaging money. Our clients were panicking." "What did you do?" I asked, my voice strained, already dreading the answer. Arthur couldn't meet my eyes. I protected myself. The restructured partnership agreement allowed me to place all liability on your father. I told our clients that the acquisition had been his initiative, against my recommendation. I made him the scapegoat. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room as the full impact of his words hit me. You betrayed him, I said, my voice barely a whisper. You betrayed your best friend and business partner. Yes, Arthur admitted, the single word heavy with decades of guilt. I destroyed his professional reputation. The clients who didn't withdraw their investments completely sided with me. I renamed the firm Sterling Capital Solutions and essentially erased your father from its history. I thought of my father in those years after the business failure. His depression, his withdrawal, the way he became a shadow of himself. It wasn't just financial ruin. It was betrayal by someone he had trusted completely. The divorce, I said, sudden realization dawning. My parents' divorce wasn't just about money, was it? Arthur shook his head. Daniel never told your mother the full truth. He carried the shame of being labeled incompetent and reckless. Their marriage couldn't survive it. I felt tears threatening, but forced them back. You didn't just destroy his business, you destroyed our family. Clara, Arthur said, his voice breaking slightly. I have regretted my actions every day since. I tried to reach out to Daniel years later to make amends, but he refused to speak to me. I can't blame him for that. The study door opened fully, and Brooke stepped in, her face pale. Is this true? She asked, looking between Arthur and Ethan. Did your family's wealth come from destroying our father? Ethan stood abruptly. This is ancient history. Whatever happened between Dad and your father has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us, Brooke countered, a strength in her voice I hadn't heard in years. My family fell apart because of what your father did. Dad was never the same after. Clara and I lost everything. And now you know why I never told you, Arthur said to Ethan, his gaze unwavering. I'm not proud of the foundation this family's wealth was built on. I stood, needing to move, to process the bombshell that had just been dropped on my understanding of my family's past. All these years, I said. Dad never told us. He carried this alone. He was protecting you, Arthur said quietly, from the ugly truth that the world isn't fair, that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who hurt you worst. Ethan looked stunned, as if the carefully constructed narrative of his family's success was crumbling before his eyes. Why are you telling us this now? After all these years, he demanded of his father. Arthur looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps seeing my father in my features. Because the past has a way of finding us, no matter how far we run. And because I'm tired of living with this secret. He turned to Ethan. And because I didn't raise you to treat people the way you treated Clara tonight. A heavy silence fell over the study. Decades of secrets, lies, and guilt hung in the air between us. The truth was finally out. But what we would do with it remained to be seen. Brooke and I returned to the dining room in a daze, followed by Ethan, who looked like he'd seen a ghost, and Arthur, whose shoulders seemed to have acquired a permanent stoop after our conversation. The remaining dinner guests were lingering over coffee and digestives, their curious eyes following our procession. Diana immediately sensed something was wrong. She set down her coffee cup and hurried over to Arthur. What's going on? She asked in a low voice. Are you ill? Arthur shook his head slowly. No, Diana, but there's something I need to say to everyone. His voice, though quiet, carried an authority that immediately silenced the room. Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on his father's arm. Dad, this isn't necessary. We can discuss this privately, as a family. That's exactly what we're going to do, Arthur replied firmly. Discuss this as a family, the entire family. He looked around the room, including Clara and Brooke. I felt the weight of everyone's stares as Arthur moved to the head of the table. Brooke gripped my hand tightly, her fingers cold against mine. I owe everyone an explanation for my behavior earlier, Arthur began, his gaze sweeping over the room, particularly Clara, who has been treated as an outsider in this house. He took a deep breath. Clara's father, Daniel Hayes, was my business partner when I started what became Sterling Capital Solutions. A murmur ran through the room. Diana's face went pale, confirming that she, at least, knew something of this history. Daniel and I built our first firm together, Arthur continued. Equal partners, equal friends. But when we disagreed on a major acquisition, He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I betrayed him. I restructured our partnership without his knowledge, proceeded with the acquisition against his advice, and when it failed catastrophically, I placed all the blame on him. The room had gone completely silent. Michael and Victoria, Ethan's siblings, exchanged shocked glances. Daniel lost everything, Arthur went on. His business, his reputation, eventually his marriage. The Hayes family was destroyed, while I rebuilt and flourished, creating the wealth and privilege that all of you have benefited from. Ethan stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Dad, stop! This isn't something that needs to be aired publicly. It's been private for too long, Arthur countered. That's the problem. It was business, Ethan insisted. These things happen, partnerships dissolve, people make strategic decisions. It wasn't just business, I found myself saying, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. It was friendship, it was trust. My father trusted yours, and that trust was betrayed in the worst possible way. Ethan turned to me, his expression cold. You've been here for 3 hours, and somehow you've managed to turn a simple birthday dinner into a public confession about business decisions made 30 years ago. Don't blame Clara for this, Brooke said, stepping to my side, her voice firm. She didn't even know about any of this until tonight, and neither did we, Victoria added, looking at her father with confusion and hurt. Dad, why keep this secret all these years? Did Mom know? All eyes turned to Diana, who stood frozen by her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping its back. Diana knew, Arthur confirmed quietly. She's always known. I knew some of it, Diana clarified, her voice brittle. I knew there had been a failed partnership, that Daniel Hayes had been blamed. She looked at Arthur. I didn't know you had deliberately set him up to take the fall. You never asked for details, Arthur said, his voice flat. You were happy to accept the benefits without questioning their source. The accusation hung in the air between them. Decades of complicit silence suddenly exposed. This is ridiculous, Ethan exploded. So Dad made some cutthroat business decisions decades ago. That's how fortunes are built. No one gets rich by being nice. Is that really what you believe? Brooke asked, looking at her husband as if seeing him clearly for the first time. That decency is a weakness. That loyalty means nothing in the face of profit. Ethan faltered under her gaze. I'm just saying that the business world has different rules. Dad did what he had to do. No, Arthur said firmly. I did what was easiest, what protected me, at someone else's expense. And I've regretted it every day since. He turned to me. Clara, I can never undo the damage I caused to your family, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. This apology couldn't heal my father's wounds or restore our lost years, but it was something. An acknowledgement at least. So this is why you introduced Clara as Brooke's weird cousin, Michael said, looking at Ethan with growing distaste. You knew who she was all along. Ethan's face reddened. I had no idea her father was Dad's former partner. Brooke never mentioned her father's business history. Because she didn't know, I said. Neither of us did. Dad never talked about it. But you did know Clara was Brooke's sister, not her cousin, Victoria pointed out to Ethan. That was just gratuitous cruelty. Ethan looked around the room, suddenly realizing he had lost control of the narrative. I was making a joke. Clara knows that. Do I asked, my voice quiet but cutting. Because it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like what it was, a deliberate attempt to diminish me, to mark me as an outsider. You've always treated Clara with contempt, Brooke said, her voice growing stronger, gaining confidence with every word. From the moment we met, you've dismissed her work, her choices, her entire existence. I've tolerated her for your sake, Ethan shot back, his voice rising, her constant judgment, her holier-than-thou artistic integrity. Tolerated me, I repeated incredulously. I'm her sister. And I'm her husband, Ethan countered. Which relationship do you think matters more? It's not a competition, Ethan, Brooke said, her voice ice-cold. Or at least it shouldn't be. The tension in the room was palpable. Family members shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether they should leave or stay for this unexpected airing of grievances. What I don't understand, Charlotte, Michael's wife, spoke up, is why this is all coming out now, after all these years. Because secrets poison everything they touch, Arthur said wearily. I've watched my son treat Clara with the same disregard I showed her father, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. You've been carrying this guilt all these years, Diana said, a note of accusation in her voice. Is that why you've been so distant? Why you throw yourself into work? Partly, Arthur admitted, but also because I built this family's success on a lie, and deep down, I've always known it would eventually come to light. So what happens now? Michael asked, looking between his father and me. Do we just apologize and move on? It's not that simple, I said. My father lost everything. His business, his reputation, his marriage. That can't be undone with an apology. What do you want then? Ethan demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. Money? Is that why you're here, looking for some kind of payout? Ethan, Brooke gasped, genuinely shocked. How dare you? It's a fair question, he insisted. Her father failed in business, and now she shows up at our dinner, coincidentally reveals this ancient history, and suddenly Dad's confessing his sins. It seems convenient. I had no idea about any of this until tonight, I said, anger rising in my chest. I came here because my sister asked me to, despite knowing how you'd treat me. Well, pardon me if I find that hard to believe, Ethan sneered. That's enough, Ethan, Brooke said, her voice shaking. I've watched you belittle my sister for years, Ethan. I've made excuses for you. I've chosen peace over confrontation. But I won't stand here and let you accuse her of some kind of extortion scheme. Brooke, Ethan began, but she cut him off. No, I'm done. She turned to me. Clara, I'm so sorry for all of this, but especially for not standing up for you sooner. The raw emotion in her voice brought tears to my eyes. It's okay, I said, squeezing her hand. It's not okay, she insisted. None of this is okay. She looked around the room at the family she had married into. I thought I wanted this life, the security, the status, but at what cost? My relationship with my sister, my self-respect. Ethan stared at her, seemingly unable to process this rebellion. You're overreacting, he said dismissively. Let's discuss this privately. No more privacy, Brooke said firmly. No more secrets. No more pretending. She turned to Diana. I've spent 5 years trying to fit into this family, changing everything about myself to meet your expectations. But I can't do it anymore. Diana's face was a mask of controlled emotion. Brooke, dear, you're upset. We all are. Let's not say things we'll regret. That's just it, Brooke replied. I don't regret saying this. I regret not saying it sooner. She turned to me. Clara, I'd like to leave now. Would you come with me? Before I could answer, Arthur spoke again. Before you go, there's something else I need to say. He looked directly at me. Clara, I can never undo the damage I caused your family, but I want to make amends in whatever way I can. Dad, Ethan protested, but Arthur silenced him with a look. I've set aside a significant portion of my personal assets, Arthur continued. Not company funds, but my own money. I'd like to establish a trust in Daniel Hayes' name. Half will go to a scholarship fund for young business students with ethical leadership potential. The other half will be divided equally between you and Brooke, to use however you see fit. Ethan looked thunderstruck. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious, Arthur replied. It won't change the past, but it's a start toward acknowledging the truth and trying to make it right. I didn't know how to respond. No amount of money could restore what our family had lost. But the gesture itself, the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, meant something. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I need time to think about it. This has been a lot to process, Arthur nodded. Of course. There's no deadline, no pressure. The offer stands whenever you're ready to discuss it. Brooke looked at me, then back at Ethan. I need some time too, she said, to think about everything. The implication was clear. She wasn't just talking about Arthur's offer. Ethan's face hardened. Fine, think. But remember where your loyalties should lie. That's exactly what I'll be thinking about, Brooke replied quietly. As we gathered our things to leave, the Sterling family remained in the dining room. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect life now irrevocably cracked. The truth had finally emerged, bringing with it both pain and possibility. What would grow from these broken foundations remained to be seen. 3 months passed after that fateful dinner at the Sterling estate. Spring arrived in Portland, bringing with it not just new growth in the city parks, but new beginnings in my own life as well. I sat on a bench outside the small cafe where I'd agreed to meet Brooke, watching people stroll by in the mild afternoon sunshine. So much had changed since that night, when Arthur Sterling had revealed the truth about our father's past. Some changes were painful, others healing, but all necessary. After we left the Sterling estate that night, Brooke had come home with me to my apartment in the Pearl District. We'd stayed up until dawn, talking more openly than we had in years. She cried as she confessed how unhappy she'd been in her marriage, how she'd convinced herself that financial security and status were worth the slow erosion of her identity. I admitted my own failings, how I'd judged her choices without fully understanding her motivations, how I'd sometimes held on to resentment instead of reaching out with compassion. "I should have stood up for you," she'd said, her eyes red from crying. "Every time Ethan dismissed you or your work, I should have said something. And I should have tried harder to understand your choices," I'd replied, "instead of just feeling abandoned when you married into that world." That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship as sisters. The truth, painful as it was, had cleared away the accumulated debris of misunderstandings and unspoken hurts. Brooke had moved out of the home she shared with Ethan the following week, taking a small apartment downtown in Seattle while she figured out her next steps. Their separation wasn't officially a divorce yet, but the direction seemed clear. Ethan had alternated between anger, bargaining, and dismissiveness, unable or unwilling to acknowledge how his behavior had contributed to the breakdown of their marriage. I spotted Brooke approaching the cafe, her copper hair, so like mine, catching the sunlight. She looked different, lighter somehow, though I knew she was still working through the pain of her marriage's collapse. "Sorry I'm late," she said, hugging me before sitting down. "The meeting with the lawyer ran long." "How did it go?" I asked. She sighed. "About as well as could be expected. Ethan's still fighting the prenup, claiming emotional distress or whatever." She shook her head. "Enough about that. Have you heard from Arthur?" I nodded, stirring my iced tea. "He called yesterday. The Daniel Hayes Foundation is officially established. The first scholarships will be awarded this fall." After much thought, I had accepted Arthur's offer to establish the foundation, though with conditions. The majority of the funds would go to the scholarship program, supporting students who demonstrated both business acumen and ethical leadership. A smaller portion would fund a grant program for artists documenting urban renewal in post-industrial cities, combining my father's business legacy with my own artistic vision. Brooke and I had both declined the personal financial offers, feeling that directing the resources toward helping others was a more fitting tribute to our father. "Have you told Dad yet?" Brooke asked. That was the most complicated part of all this. Our father, Daniel Hayes, had built a quiet life for himself in Santa Fe, New Mexico, after the divorce. He taught business ethics at a community college, a modest career that nonetheless allowed him to use his knowledge in a positive way. When we'd called to tell him about Arthur's confession, there had been a long silence on the phone. "I never wanted you girls to know," he'd finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you from the ugliness of it all. We needed to know," I told him gently, "not just about what happened to you, but about how you picked yourself up afterward, how you rebuilt your life with integrity, even after everything was taken from you." He'd cried then, really cried, perhaps for the first time since the betrayal decades ago. It was the beginning of his own healing process, one that was still ongoing. I told him about the foundation, I said to Brooke. Now he's processing it. Says he needs time to decide if he wants his name associated with anything connected to Arthur Sterling. "That's fair," Brooke acknowledged. "After what Arthur did to him." "Arthur called him directly last week," I added. "They spoke for over an hour." "Really?" Brooke looked surprised. "Dad didn't mention that when we talked." "I think it's still too raw for him to discuss easily," I said. "But he did say something about laying old ghosts to rest. I think finally having his story acknowledged, having the truth come out after all these years, has helped him more than any financial reparation could." Brooke nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of truth coming out, did you hear about the changes at Sterling Capital Solutions?" I hadn't, and said so. "Arthur announced his retirement last week," Brooke explained. "But before stepping down, he instituted a complete overhaul of the company's ethical guidelines and governance structure, created an independent ethics board with real power to review major decisions. She smiled slightly. Apparently, Ethan is furious. He was supposed to take over as CEO, but now he'll have to answer to this board. Karma works in mysterious ways, I said, unable to suppress a small smile of my own. Indeed, it does, came a voice from behind us. We turned to find Arthur Sterling standing there, looking both out of place and oddly vulnerable in our bohemian neighborhood cafe. He seemed older than he had at the dinner, but somehow more at peace. "Arthur," I said, surprised. "What are you doing in Portland?" "Your father invited me," he replied simply. "We're meeting for coffee later, trying to, well, not rebuild a friendship exactly, but find some kind of peace with the past." He hesitated. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I saw you both through the window and wanted to say hello." Brooke's expression was guarded, but not hostile. "How's Ethan?" she asked. Arthur sighed. Angry, resistant to change, but perhaps this is the wake-up call he needs. He looked at both of us. I failed as a father in many ways, allowing him to become the man who could treat both of you so dismissively. That's another regret to add to my list. "People can change," I said, surprising myself with the sentiment. "If they're willing to face the truth about themselves." Arthur nodded. "That's what I'm trying to do, however late in the game." He glanced at his watch. "I should go. Your father values punctuality." A small, sad smile crossed his face. Another quality I once admired in him, before I betrayed his trust. As he turned to leave, I found myself saying, "Arthur, thank you, not for the money or the foundation, but for finally telling the truth. It's meant more to all of us than you know." He nodded, emotion briefly clouding his eyes before he composed himself and walked away. Brooke and I watched him go, both lost in our own thoughts. "Do you think Dad will ever forgive him?" she finally asked. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I think talking about it, acknowledging what happened instead of burying it, is healing for Dad, regardless of whether forgiveness comes." "And what about you?" Brooke asked. "Have you forgiven Arthur, or Ethan for that matter?" I considered the question carefully. "Forgiveness is a process, not a moment," I said. "I'm working on it, not for their sake, but for mine." I reached across the table to take her hand. "What about you? What comes next?" Brooke smiled, a genuine smile that reminded me of the sister I'd grown up with. "I'm applying to graduate programs in social work. I want to help families in crisis, maybe stop some kids from going through what we did." "That's perfect for you," I said, squeezing her hand. The Brooke I've always known has such a huge capacity for empathy and care. "I lost sight of her for a while," Brooke admitted, her eyes shining. "But she's finding her way back." As we continued our conversation, making plans for a road trip to visit our father in Santa Fe, I reflected on the strange, painful journey that had brought us to this moment. A casual dismissal at a dinner party had unraveled decades of secrets and lies, forcing all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our families. Yet, from that painful reckoning had come authentic healing. My relationship with Brooke was stronger than it had been in years. Our father was finally beginning to process his long-buried trauma. Even Arthur Sterling was attempting to make amends, however imperfectly. Some wounds never fully heal, and some betrayals leave permanent scars. But there is power in speaking truth, in bringing secrets into the light. My father's name, our name, Hayes, once erased from a company's history, was now being honored. The truth of his integrity, maintained even in the face of devastating betrayal, was finally acknowledged. As for Ethan Sterling and his casual cruelty in introducing me as Brooke's quirky cousin who does some art thing, honestly, I almost have to thank him. Without that moment, without that deliberate attempt to diminish me, the truth might never have emerged. Sometimes our worst moments lead to our greatest healing. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone's attempt to hurt you unexpectedly led to positive change? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that sometimes family secrets need to be exposed before healing can begin. Thank you for listening, and remember that your name, your true identity, holds power that no one can diminish.